All right, welcome back once again to our final lecture of the 18th century, although there's going to be a little bit of hangers-on that we're going to talk about next week, just to avoid some tonal whiplash that'll make sense here in a little bit. Previously, we had talked about the Enlightenment. We're going to go into a little bit more of it today, but this is essentially going to be where people look at maybe where the modern world comes from. It comes about, it gets its inception in the 18th century. One of which we're going to barely talk about because it doesn't have very much to do with today, but it will later on, is the Industrial Revolution. It gets its start towards the tail end of the 18th century and runs to about the mid 19th century, where there are all of these like big factories, basically people are being able to produce at scale. C.S. Lewis argues that around the age of the Industrial Revolution, circa the 1760s, was the single biggest mental, emotional, and social divide separating the pre-modern and modern era, the introduction of the machine. And in fact, one fact that's really kind of fun is that it's during this time where there's so many children working in factories that a man named Robert Raikes in England notices that there are children laboring in factories 6 days a week and often spend their one day off. Can you guess what day they have off? It's Sunday. They're doing all kinds of fun things with their money that they couldn't do elsewise. They're running around, they're gambling, they're using their money for things that they shouldn't be spending their money on. There's no education and there's no supervision. So then, what can you do in order to help minister to the children in that regard? Well, Robert Raikes gets children from impoverished families and starts teaching them reading and writing, basic hygienic instructions, how to be good citizens, moral lessons drawn from Scripture, often in teachers' homes or other simple settings like that, and essentially creates a school you can go to on Sundays, a Sunday school, if you will. And, originally it was basically meant to give basic education and help, these kids out socially, more than explicit evangelism. However, later on, that gets adopted more and more, and in fact, that's still kind of what we call it today anyway, is Sunday school. And it comes from one man who had a vision for the kids who were working themselves to death during the Industrial Revolution. But we're going to spend a little more time in philosophy, because philosophy and tracing the lines of thought throughout all of that is going to be a bit more close to home for what we're talking about today. So, reason is the word of the hour. Reason is what we are looking towards. First and foremost, what can we use our minds for? How can we work our way mentally, emotionally towards outside of existing structures? They believe that society and government could be improved through a rational analysis rather than looking at divine right or the customs that were previously instituted. The Renaissance had already set the stage, the Reformation had sown the seeds, and now we are questioning all of the social norms. Instead of just looking at Aristotle, why not use our own philosophy to be able to answer the questions of existence? I mean, Galileo, Copernicus, Newton, all these men were working outside of the church who were doing their own astronomy, maybe a little bit of astrology as well. But this is what happens when you empower the public to get their own answers rather than looking at the past or to rely upon existing structures of powers. So these people sought to understand nature using their own reason, observation, and experimentation rather than rely upon what had come before. So then, if you are just looking at the world rationally or using reason, where does religion fit into all of this? And that is going to come up in the form of deism, which we've talked about again. But deism is essentially the ability to reason out that there is a divine being using only natural phenomena. And I'm going to jump the gun. I'm going to give you a quote from Voltaire. So there are plenty of people who have deism as sort of the religion of the hour. And in fact, can we get the first slide? Perfect, thank you. This is what they say about the deist creed, if you will. This being, this ultimate being, this God of deism, This being who wills things and can carry out his will, this being who works by his own power, this being, whoever he might be, who animates the universe and brings harmony to all things, this is what I call God. To this name of God, I add the notions of mind, power, will, which I have gathered from the order of the universe, and on the notion of benevolence, which is their essential result. Even so, I know nothing further of the being to whom I attribute these things. He hides himself both from my senses and my reason. The more I think of him, the more confused I become. I know very well that he exists, and that he exists as the uncreated one. I know that my existence depends on his, and that every other created thing also depends on him. I see the deity everywhere in his works. I feel him within me. I behold him in all of creation around me. But if I try to contemplate him in his own being, if I seek to discover where he is, what is his essence, then he eludes my grasp, and my anxious spirit finds nothing. Convinced of my mind's feebleness, therefore, I will never enter into arguments about God's nature unless I am forced into it by the feelings of his relationship with myself. So if people looking to simply use their mental faculties to reason out that a God exists. So deism, you will see them refer to this idea of a God. They'll call him the supreme being, or in a lot of our founding documents, you'll see the God of nature, the God that can be seen throughout nature. And in fact, Scripture says to it that God decrees himself he writes himself on everyone's heart. Everyone knows that there is a God intrinsically. That's the general revelation. Even general revelation leads us to believe that there is a God, that there is a supreme power, but only special revelation can reveal the personal relationship that he desires with his creation. Deists believe that since God is perfect and we live within creation, creation therefore must be perfect. He would have no need to tinker with it, so that's why they call him the great clockmaker, the great watchmaker. He simply created it, wound it up, and let it go. It is working as intended. There is no need for any sort of interference within it. Therefore, we would say that he doesn't do any sort of miracles, and as such, they would outright reject Christianity, because what's more personal than God becoming man? Not much. So this sort of deism leads to a blanket rejection of Christianity, and in some cases, you've got, Gnosticism or agnostics, where we can't really know for sure. There is a God, but we don't know which God it is. In fact, you can move from deism to agnosticism and all the way down into atheism. There just is no God. Reason cannot point me sufficiently to God, therefore I must reject that he exists. Also, there's going to be a movement towards the idea that humans possess inherent rights like life, liberty, property, and equality that governments must protect, not just grant to the people. There are also big critiques of what's called absolutism, which is the divine right of kings, this idea of that there is an untouchable monarchy that has been put there by God and must always exist like that. There are the nobles, the clergy, all of that, they just exist there because they got there themselves. There is no sort of divinity that is ascribed in their office. The church's influence was seen as irrational and oppressive, and there are a lot of these ideas are going to be put forth in a 1789 work called The Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. And the idea is that we are looking more towards the individual rather than the system itself. We're going from the inside out rather than top down. So let's talk about some key philosophers. One that we've brought up before, this is a deist who had some very, very big moves both in the American and French Revolution, who sought very, very highly to push morals onto society. It's a man who wrote this work right here, rather these two works right here. Common Sense and the Rights of Man by Thomas Paine. He was all over the place, and he is a very, very deistic sort of writer. You cannot get away from that. He calls the Bible cruel and evil. He rejects it outright, as he would the Christian God himself. Still very, very interesting, and a very, very motivational tool that was used for public perception that moved people towards the revolutions on either side of the Atlantic. So the thing is, if he's pushing morality, but he doesn't believe in the God of the Bible, whose morality is he pushing? Whenever you look at sort of deistic writers, they are going to look towards morals, but then if you can't know the God who is giving you these morals, how can you know that those morals themselves are good and not that you happen to think that they are good? How can we know that these things are good without true special revelation, which is the very thing that these men are going to dismiss? We can't talk about the Age of Revolution without very quickly revisiting John Locke. He's an Englishman, but his work is very important, both in the inception of the American ideas of government and freedom, as well as what's happening in France later on. He's going to argue for natural rights, life, liberty, and property, government by consent. The government must rule by the authority of the people. If rulers violate what's called the social contract, people have the right to revolt. His ideas are going to help throw the idea that the monarchy has forfeited their legitimacy by rejecting these sorts of things, by oppressing the people. How about Voltaire? A lot of these guys are also going to be French. There were lots of French philosophers and philosophers around this time. Voltaire is going to champion religious tolerance. He's going to go for freedom of speech. He's going to criticize the Catholic Church a lot. I'm going to butcher lots of French words tonight, so please excuse me. He's got a work called Crush the Infamous Thing, Écraser l'infâme, which is talking about the Catholic Church itself. And to let you know, at this point, London is probably like the biggest city, multicultural, most successful city on the planet right here. But France is like the capital of Europe. France is huge. The seats of power have very, very much consolidated and congregated in France. So we now have lots of people congregating towards France. In fact, French is actually probably the unofficial official language of Europe at this time. Then we've got a man called Jean-Jacques Rousseau. He is a Genevan, but he wrote in French and later on is going to live in France. He writes something called the Social Contract, which declares this: man is born free and everywhere he is in chains. This is going to be one of the big rallying cries of the French Revolution, is that man is inherently good. To let you cheat a little bit later, we're going to be discussing the ideals that are going to underpin the American and French Revolution. This is completely opposite to what we think. Americans believe that man is naturally bad and laws exist to curb that evil tendency, and we see that that is very consistent with what we read in the Bible about the heart of man. But they would say that man is inherently good, and it is society who corrupts him. Rousseau is going to promote the general will, which is the collective good, over individual interests. So we empower the individual, but we must employ all for the general will, or the collective good of people. It's going to... he's going to argue for people to have more say in government and have direct participation in how they make their laws. His work very explicitly, and you'll notice that he's going to die a couple of decades before the French Revolution kicks off, or rather 1 decade before the French Revolution kicks off. But his writing is going to inspire the most radical of the participants in there, and whenever they start crying to overthrow the monarchy, they're going to be quoting Rousseau. But probably the biggest philosopher of this age is a man that if you have any interaction in philosophy, we are downstream of him, and it's a man called Immanuel Kant. German philosopher. Oh boy. Immanuel Kant, I cannot do him justice, and I'm sure if any sort of philosophy majors listen to this, they're going to be very upset with me. He is going to argue for the fact that we must use reason independently. He's going to write something called What is Enlightenment? He's going to say you need to dare to know. He pushes forward this crazy idea called transcendental idealism. He is going to say that all of our knowledge is filtered through our mental and sensory equipment. So you can say that there is objective reality, but we can only ever know objective reality through the filter of our minds and what we can sense, what we can see, hear, smell, taste, touch, you get it. We can only ever know things as they seem to be or as they appear to us. Kant is going to call these things that have been filtered to us phenomena. Phenomena, the Muppets, you get it. So we've got phenomena, and the things as they exist, objectively, he's going to call them noumena. These things we can never truly know. We can never truly know them because everything must, by necessity, be filtered through our understanding and through our senses, what we can see and what our brains can comprehend. So then, what does this mean about God? If God is the noumena, we can never really truly understand what God is like because we can only ever have some tentative grasp of the phenomena of God. So as you can see, he's got a very huge influence on philosophy. He's going to then look at, well, how can we ever fully grasp this? So we need to instead focus on what does that mean through the filter of our understanding. However, through all of this, Immanuel Kant is a theist. He believes that God exists. Even though we can never fully grasp him or even begin to fully grasp him, he still is going to argue for the existence of a God. He's got something that he writes called the religion within the limits of reason alone. If you recall, we've looked at several proofs that people have put forward to God. Remember, God is the utmost created good, that which nothing greater than can be conceived. He's not satisfied with that. He's not satisfied with any sort of philosophical proof that God exists. So he comes up with the moral argument for the existence of God. And this is something that the deists are going to rely pretty heavily upon. This is a sort of deistic understanding of God. It's called the categorical imperative. The inherent and inescapable sense of right and wrong, which belongs to every single human person on the planet, comes from the God who created a moral order. So we have morality, therefore God exists. But here are the proofs that we get in there. He says, for our sense of moral obligation to be meaningful, certain things must also be true. Morality, whenever morality is not met, justice must be upheld. Justice is necessary where right behavior is rewarded and bad behavior is punished. If crime pays, there is no need to be virtuous. There's no practical reason for it. So from there, okay, but what would be necessary for justice to take place, a full and a true justice? So, number 2, life after death must exist because we know that this world does not dispense justice perfectly. So, either 2 options then. Either the next life is just as unjust as this one is now, or going on into infinity, or number 3, there must be, at some point, a judge who is morally perfect and righteous, because if that judge is not perfectly righteous, we're going to have the possibility of injustice. Now then, suppose this perfect judge is morally upright, does the best job he can, but is limited in his knowledge and therefore can make mistakes for lack of information. If there is going to be true justice, this cannot logically be, which leads to the 4th portion of Kant's argument. This judge must be omniscient so that he can account for all the facts. That's part of it, that's nice, but supposing you have somebody who just knows how to accomplish right and wrong morally, that's not good enough. This judge must also have the power to enforce his judgment. He must be omnipotent. Because if he were powerless or restricted in any way for bringing justice, then there's no guarantee he will be able to do it. So in all of this, the moral argument is morals exist. Okay, we understand that morals exist. For morals to have an ultimate point and purpose, there must be a judge to reward good and punish evil. He must do so perfectly with perfect knowledge and with perfect power to enforce this judgment. Therefore, a God exists. We've not proven that the God of the Bible exists, but a God exists. And you'll see in lots of the writing from this time that this is the sort of God that people are going to ascribe to. I must live well, I must be a moral person, etc. And in fact, you'll see lots of sort of deistic sort of teaching sort of trickle down into popular Christianity as well. This idea that I just need to do good, I'll be rewarded by doing good, and I'll be punished by doing bad. So then, throughout all of this enlightenment, we are erasing the status quo. If we're getting rid of these assumed powers, whenever we keep eroding them, what is the natural result of that? Where do you stop? If you keep chipping away at the base, and I don't like this, and I don't like this, and we're questioning that, where does it stop? Who decides? Around this time is where the start of biblical criticism gets in there, which is a double-edged sword. On one hand, biblical criticism can show us deeper truths. Okay, did Moses write the final chapter of Deuteronomy? Probably not. But does that mean, then, with better scholarship, that we can understand better about what the original recipients of that text would have understood? And even though it was not authored by his hand, we can still attribute authorship to Moses for that book because he's directly involved with what's happening after his death. Yeah, we can find out who wrote what, when, where, why, and how. Biblical scholarship, criticism, we look at something and say, I'm not just assuming that that is true, I'm going to look for proof that it is true. Now, the other side of that argument then becomes, I don't accept that that is true, and I'm going to attack it so you don't believe it is true either. They use it to dismantle the authority of the Bible and so take religion into their own hands. As the 18th century gets underway, this attitude is going to slide very easily into a much more comprehensive ability of every man to say, you know what, I can figure all of this out myself. I've got the means to read. I've got the means to think for myself. The church does not have a monopoly on anything in my life. And in fact, maybe assumed powers from God in the form of the king or the church is kind of bad. So rational thinkers are going to start giving critical passes to even Aristotle in the sphere of natural science. So if we're going to be criticizing the natural realm, why not criticize the spiritual realm as well and not just assume that everything is true? Getting rid of the authority of the Bible and seeing where it takes us. There are two roads in front of us. One is the American Revolution with all the good and ill that comes of it, and the other is the French Revolution for all the good and ill that comes of it. Now, this year we are going to be celebrating the 250th anniversary of the founding of our nation. I'm very excited. Is anybody going to be doing anything special, like reading extra books, watching documentaries, etc.? I am. I've already started. There are too many books for me to actually read. This one's on my to-read list, The Glorious Cause. I've also got 1776 by McCullough in there. Rick Atkinson's got a work that literally just traces through all of the different battles that were fought during the Revolutionary War, and boy, is it graphic. It is nasty what people went through. It's not just this very pretty red coats marching and then shooting and then moving and marching. And no, it's really gross. You get to find out just how many times people were stabbed on any given day. It's not good, but it is a very entertaining read. So the American Revolution, I am not going to go into too much detail. You can find out all of the fun little information yourself, and odds are you've had classes where you've learned a whole lot of this yourself. We are going to look at some of the factors that go into it and some of the outcomes of it, but I'm not going to mention basically any of the founding fathers or any of like the fun little battles that go in there or any sort of the documents we've got in there, because you probably know all this already, and if you don't, you can very easily find it. So, what led to all of this? How about the Enlightenment? The idea that there are some shifts in the understandings of how we engage with power structures, that are going to, again, erode this idea that just because the king is in command does not mean that he gets to keep that command for good or ill. We can't just ignore the plight of the common man. Or something we talked about last week, how about the Great Awakening? We've got all of these Protestant denominations who are now united around things that unite all evangelicals around today. Personal conversion, a born-again experience, voluntary faith, not just this sort of creedal understanding where it's because my parents are saved, I am a part of the faith community, I am a part of that royal priesthood, the holy nation belonging to God. It's a voluntary faith. And it's evangelical piety. Remember we talked about the rise of pietism starting over in Germany? You remember that. It was only like 7 months ago. It's fine. This is going to move from a much more European style of Christianity towards an American Christianity, where it's a much more personal thing. And even though I disagree with our Presbyterian brothers about the role of baptizing infants, there's still a whole lot of things I can agree with them about, and I can shake hands with them and not try stoning them whenever they come into my city. Quakers, on the other hand, though. They've got their oats, and that's about it. I kid. Or do I? So we had Jonathan Edwards, George Whitefield. They're promoting unity across denominations, challenging traditional authority structures, because the whole old lights versus new lights. And because I forgot to mention it last week, I'll go ahead and mention it again this week. Jonathan Edwards had a grandson who was a very famous man, became vice president. And I tried to get my wife to guess who this vice president was. And I was like, yeah, he was the vice president to the third president of the United States. And she's like, oh, Adams? No. Like, oh yeah, Jefferson. I was like, yep, it was Jefferson. And he's in the air. She goes, it was Aaron Burr. And I was like, it was Aaron Burr. Aaron Burr is Jonathan Edwards' grandson. What a fun fact. Jonathan Edwards did not live to see his grandson try to, invade Mexico or any of that fun stuff. Anyway, throughout all of this, we can look at the fact that this religious persecution of Pennsylvania is very much for the Quakers. So if you're a Baptist, no, we're going to run you out of town. We're going to persecute you. And people are dying for their different denominational beliefs or sects, as we designated them previously. But in all of this, we can agree that you should have the freedom to practice the sort of religion that you want. In fact, we've got the evangelicals and the deists partnering together on the front of religious tolerance. Evangelicals are prioritizing personal faith and liberty, and deists, like a certain man named Thomas Jefferson, are going to be talking about religious freedom over doctrinal uniformity. We're not looking to establish a system of religion. We're looking to establish personal piety in however that works within the system, so we're not just continually fighting ourselves. So, here's some of the things that are uniting all these people together. There is a creator God who grants inalienable rights. Human sinfulness requires checks on power. Virtue is needed to sustain these republics, and providence must guide nations. That all sounds very good. Around this time, we've got a man named Patrick Henry who writes his very famous Liberty or Death, which is just the very, very final portion of that. I actually read that this last week. It's a very good, little tract that he wrote out there. It's very, very pro-revolution, and my fun fact is that I am a very unique individual, and in the place where Patrick Henry gave that speech, I actually went there to see my sister-in-law graduate a few years ago, and I may or may not have quoted the, as for me, give me liberty or give me death thing, because I'm a very original person. Nobody has ever done that before. Nobody would ever say the same thing as another famous man in the famous place where he said that. Nothing. Another push towards revolution is Common Sense, again, written by Thomas Paine. And in fact, it was so widely spread that it may be the pamphlet or tract that gained the most support for it. And also, there's this little thing that they wrote, which is a very Protestant and deist unifying document called the Declaration of Independence, which is going to invoke God's blessing and biblical warrants. But again, you might notice that in there they talk about the God of nature. Not necessarily the Christian God, but a God that we can reason ourselves into. But in spite of all this, Jefferson wanted our national symbol to be a picture of Moses parting the Red Sea and leading the Israelites out of Egypt. So even though he's a deist and he would reject a whole lot of what the Bible says, he still wants that very, very powerful imagery. And they shot that down, so he wanted to use another biblical symbol, and I can't remember off the top of my head what it is. But eventually, Thomas Jefferson wanted to use biblical imagery to showcase our country, and he got shot down in favor of what we have, the evolution of what we have today. I thought that was really neat. So how do we start? Resistance started to be framed as a defense against a tyranny threatening both civil and religious liberties. Covenantal ideas, like John Witherspoon's 1776 address, are going to tie civil liberty to religious freedom. So we're starting to get this blending together of things. So why did we actually fight the American Revolution? There's a bunch of different reasons, one of which is going to be financial. Relations between our colonies. How many colonies were there at the start? 13 colonies, very good. Your 6th grade social studies teachers are going to be very, very, very happy with you. So we've got the 13 colonies and British Parliament on one side. Relations are going to worsen at the end of the 7 Years' War, which some call the French and Indian War, in 1763. This cost England a whole lot of money, like a whole lot of money. Trying to wage a war on a foreign continent when you are 2 months behind in news, because it takes a month to get things over there and then another month to bring them back, or 6 weeks or so, takes a lot of time and resources. Supply chains, that is crazy. Major, major debt. So how are you going to recoup some of those losses? Well, you start taxing your citizens, like the Stamp Act and the Townsend Acts. And these sorts of things get known as the intolerable acts, where it's essentially, you are getting taxed, there is nothing you can say about it, Parliament has already decreed it, you must now start using our paper with the stamps on it in order for any sort of legitimate business to be done. Also, you have to buy them at whatever price we set for it. And also, you can only get them from here. Lots of things happen as a result of that. You know, there's a big tea party. There's some other things like that. We're going to skip all of that. Here's one thing that maybe you've heard of, maybe you haven't. How about the Quebec Act? Up in Canada, we are going to expand that territory. We're going to restore French civil law, and we're going to grant Catholics more rights in Canada. The English government just allowed the Protestants to gain a foothold in Canada. What happens if they try to bring it in here? What's going to happen when the king's going to appoint a bishop to oversee all of these particular things? And is there going to be a unification of England with Catholicism? Not in America, there's not. So this was another intolerable act to many of the Protestant people. It promoted, quote, popery amongst certain people groups. It's threatening Protestant dominance over in the colonies. So again, we've got people linking together, fighting against a common enemy, even if that enemy just happens to have a perceived favoritism towards Catholicism. So then, as we move into the discussion of freedom of religion, which we've been dancing around this whole time, how many of you have heard of a man called Isaac Backus before? I figured you might. He's one that I had not heard very much of growing up, at least in public schools. This man was a Baptist. He was born as a Congregationalist in Connecticut. He was converted during the Great Awakening, became a separate preacher, then a Baptist. He started his own church, served as a pastor until he died. He wrote a sermon called An Appeal to the Public for Religious Liberty, argued against blending church and state. This is something we're going to be talking about a little bit more in the French Revolution, but the idea that if you have your state, you get to decide what your state-sponsored religion is. In Pennsylvania, it's the Quakers. In Rhode Island, it's whatever you want. But there's not really a whole lot of Baptist places. So the Baptists get a whole lot of persecution, but if you're a Presbyterian and you go up to the Quakers, well, you're going to have some persecution there. So it's basically this idea that there is a state-approved denomination of Christianity, specifically Christianity. And if you do not ascribe to that, the state has the power to persecute you, to throw you in jail, to execute you, to enact all of these different fines and taxes on you if you do not happen to agree with their particular stance on doctrine. So Isaac Backus is going to push against that and say maybe the establishment of a state-sponsored religion, regardless of what it is bad, because then the state is empowered to persecute you based on that. He's going to petition the Continental Congress in 1774 for this idea. He's going to support the revolution, all while fighting both for American and for Baptist rights. He viewed the civil and religious liberties as a two-front war, his words, and advocated for a voluntary faith as foundational to a republican, or a unified group of people coming together, governance. Pretty cool guy. I wish I could give you way more quotes from him. So what was the Christian response to the Revolutionary War? It's kind of all over the place, especially when it comes to a little text like Romans 13. So many of the Reformed Protestant people, they thought that the revolution was legitimate because under specific conditions, like when rulers are going to violate divine laws, threaten religious liberty, or act tyrannically. Romans 13, they would say, and they're going to draw upon Calvin's reasoning in this, is that it is only submission to a just authority, especially in light of the when Paul is before the judge and they say, who should we obey, God or man? God's going to win under that. So there's a little bit of leniency in there to defy tyrants. The Institutes from Calvin says that lower magistrates could resist tyrants to protect the people and to protect the faith. So this perspective is going to frame the American Revolution as a defensive act against British oppression and not cast it as a sinful rebellion. One person in here you might have heard of, John Witherspoon. Pretty cool guy. He's going to argue that republics require Bible-based virtue, and war is a divinely sanctioned defense of that liberty. John Witherspoon was a Presbyterian. He signed a little piece of paper called the Declaration of Independence. He wrote a sermon called The Dominion of Providence Over the Passions of Men, who is going to support the revolution. He's going to urge them to take up arms against Britain, claiming that divine providence favors their cause to preserve religious liberty and prevent obedience to ungodly commands. He drew upon covenantal theology and viewed the conflict as a just war to protect faith and virtue, which is essential for a republican society. So instead of the revolutionaries or the the American peoples, we've got the loyalists. So if the Presbyterians are anti what's happening there, can you guess which denomination was strongly supportive of England? It was the Anglicans. Yeah, most of them, not all, but most of them, believe that a stricter interpretation of the divine right of monarchy views revolution as an illegitimate rebellion against God's ordained authority. They would say that Romans 13 requires absolute submission, even to flawed rulers. And to an extent, I kind of see where they're coming from. We're called to be subject to the powers that God has given. And yet, must there be a line that cannot be crossed? Especially when you look at governance that was hostile to Christianity prior to the conversion of Constantine. Did they subject themselves to the law then, when Christianity was outlawed? They saw the American uprising as driven by sectarian strife rather than piety. They say it's more civil, it's less religious. Pacifists, like the Quakers, also are going to oppose it because they're pacifists. They're not going to take up arms. So one man, I'll mention them, but the only one that's on the screen right now is a man called Samuel Seabury. He is an Anglican bishop. He is a loyalist. He's going to write anonymous pamphlets under the pseudonym A Westchester Farmer. He condemns the revolution as a sinful disobedience to Britain's God-given authority and argues for biblical grounds for those submission, Romans 13, 1 Peter chapter 2. He's going to try to prohibit armed resistance and that colonial complaints were exaggerated. True Christians should endure hardship rather than rebel. And again, I see both sides of it, and it's hard for us to determine what is a line too far. Is it something that just makes me uncomfortable? Is it violating a moral imperative from God, or is this just something that I want to do to protect my family? Where's the line? I'm not going to get into that here. John Wesley, on the other hand, where's Wesley from again? He's from England. He traveled back and forth to America several times. Where do you think he falls? He's a loyalist. He's the founder of Methodism. He wrote a calm address to our American colonies. He said that the revolution was an unjustified rebellion. He's going to bring in a lot of what John Locke says, but argues that Britain's taxation is not tyrannical enough to warrant violence. He saw the idea of revolution was contrary to Christian humility and submission, and urged loyalty to the crown as being divinely appointed. So what happened next? You'll never guess what happened during the American Revolution. The love of land, the love of neighbor, the love of your fellow man, it continued on. We secured our independence. And when you read the primary source documents from the founders, you can see that there is a lot of petition for the English crown to just relax, move some things back. You repealed the Stamp Act. That was good. However, if you do things, we will gladly resubmit to you. But again, reading primary documents, you see that The English vastly underestimated the zeal of the American people and underestimated the amount of materials it would take to adequately secure the colonies and just how big the colonies were and how terrible it would be for them to fight in. 250 years later, we're still standing. And this is going to date this very appropriately. We just beat Canada in the Olympics for hockey. Take that, Canada. So, the American Revolution, what effect did it have on the church? Well, it had a huge impact on the church. It's going to change the, like we said, this idea that there's not a state-mandated religion that was very, very popular over in Europe. It's going to move towards a more personal idea or an implementation of that religion. However, since we hitched our ideas and ideals to this idea that the republic is dependent upon these individual expressions of freedom and faith, etc., how do we unhitch that, or should we unhitch that? Disestablishment is going to advance. It's essentially going to say that there is no state-mandated religion. The First Amendment is going to, again, showcase that evangelical and deist alliance that they have on No State Church. What's the First Amendment again, Chad? What's the First Amendment? Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of petition, assembly. You did. That's the important one. Freedom of the press, yes. But religion, the second one, that is the one that we are looking at today. Where instead it's not just we want to keep religion out of the state, it's we want to keep the state out of religion. We don't want the state to be able to cudgel us using the power given to the state in order to suppress and repress various denominations of faith. So maybe do a little bit of research for whenever people say that separation of church and state, freedom of religion, all that. Let's keep in mind what the original founders had in mind before we can have that conversation. I'm not going to say what the right interpretation of that is, but we need to understand what the original vision for the country was before we can start having an idea of what that means for us today. So Christianity is going to shift very much more into voluntarism. Or it's a weird word, I promise it makes sense. Voluntary associations of church, especially when it comes to public morality, without coercing people, so those puritanical laws, those are going to start going by the wayside. We're going to keep our republic watered through persuasion and virtue, continue teaching in that. Now, I'm going to make everybody angry by briefly mentioning something, which is a very hot topic in the news, without giving it any sort of in-depth discussion that it merits, because it is beyond the scope of what we're going to be talking about here in terms of history. But a quick note on American nationalism, or Christian nationalism. So with our founding in mind, especially since we are celebrating the 250th anniversary of the founding of our nation this year, we should keep in mind the scope of the full context of it. To simply label our nation as a Christian nation is a oversimplification. It just is. Christian morals are in there? Absolutely. You cannot separate those out. But to say that this is a Christian nation, I would like to say it is, but there are so many people who are drawing upon things that are not Christian in their origin. I get it. I am very sympathetic to the desire to have strong public Christ followers who are pious in their faith and in their reasoning. I want them to be in government, and I want them to exhort the public publicly to repent and believe the gospel. These are things that I want. These are things that I think all Christians should want. However, we need to be careful not to fall into the same trap of a state-sponsored religion that we just fought, 250 years ago, to get ourselves out of. So, do you love your country? You should. This is a great country. Do you love the Lord? It's not a trick question. The answer is absolutely yes. So, love of Lord and love of country, perhaps Christian patriotism might be a better word rather than Christian nationalism. I think that allows us to move more into a more conservative approach to it so that we can avoid any sort of idolatry in our lives, where instead of uniting behind the gospel and the gospel alone, we can stay away from trying to unite behind any sort of ethnic or national identity that could potentially elevate itself above the gospel in our lives. That's problematic. Ideally, what we should do is we should pray for and elect leaders that are going to promote the spread of the gospel. That is first and foremost what we should do. Elect the people who are going to manifest change in our country. But we need to be careful that we're not just trying to make American Christianity the flavor of the week, because if you go down to another country and you want to make Christians down there as missions work, are you going to be making American Christians? No, you can't. The gospel is for all people at all times. The gospel existed before the founding of our country. It will exist long after our country is dust, provided Christ does not come back before then. And we need to not conflate our wonderful culture with Christianity, even though the two our culture is directly inspired by Christianity. So all that to say is, be careful not to get too hung up on your definitions, because people do not agree on what Christian nationalism even means. And let's perhaps just take a step back and humbly approach the spread of the gospel and elect leaders that are going to be more effective tools for the spread of the gospel, rather than wielding the sword in a way that we would not appreciate if we were on the other side of it. So that's enough about America. Let's talk about something that perhaps we are less familiar with, the French Revolution. Now, when I tell you that I could spend several lectures looking at the American Revolution and just as many looking at the French Revolution, I mean it. The French Revolution is one of the, not best, but one of the coolest things to study. Because, like we said, France had been essentially the heart of continental Europe. That was the city. Rome, Rome's just down there. That's what the Catholics have going on. But Rome, Paris, that's where it's at. The French Revolution is going to completely transform the political, social, and culture of France itself, but those ripples are going to be just about worldwide and how we look at how government works. The monarchy, it's gone in France as a result of this. Feudal privileges, gone. We're going to start getting some modern ideas of democracy, nationalism, some human rights in there. But what was the price that they paid to achieve all of these things? We're going to take a look at it. So pre-Revolution France is oftentimes called the Ancient Regime. And again, I'm going to butcher lots of French words today, so bear with me. What they have here is what's called the three estates system. The first estate are the clergy. They are made up of about 0.5% of the population. This 0.5% of the population owns 10% of the land. Tax exempt, of course. The second estate, the nobility, about 1.5%. They own 25 to 30% of the land. They are also tax exempt, and they're holding key offices. So you have 2% of the people who don't pay taxes. They hold all of the power, and they own roughly, 35 to 40% of the land. The other 98% of the population are called the bourgeoisie, or the peasantry, the urban workers who have heavy taxes. And because we are downstream of the French Revolution, we can start to see where maybe this is a bit of a bad thing. They have an absolute monarchy under Louis XVI. They believe in the divine right of kings, and they've had no representative body since 1614. So what's going to cause the French Revolution? Long term, we can look at how there's some social inequality and there are resentment of the privileges that the first and second estates are holding, that the third estate is unable to do so. Absolutism, this idea that the government reigns absolutely and there's no questioning what they do. They have the divine right, of course. How about the influence of the Enlightenment and all those French philosophers and philosophers that we've been looking at previously? And you know what happened like 20 years previously? The Americans proved it could be done. So the success of the American Revolution, maybe we can do something like that here. Pop quiz. The American Revolution, it is amazing that we won that. It's incredible. Like, so quickly, within the first year, we were so short of powder and balls. It's incredible. Who bailed us out? It was the French. As a result of France's heavy investment into the American Revolution, they went into debt. There was a whole lot of bankruptcy happening because of the American Revolution. And on top of that, in 1788 and 89, there were some bad harvests. So there's some famine. And as a result, there are riots because of that. There's no food. There's no money. Uh-oh. So after 175 years, the king calls the Estates General in May of 1789. So we've got the three estates who are coming in, who are able to, those first and second estates have more voting power than the other 98% of the population. So wouldn't you know it, they were dissatisfied with how things were being done, so they decided to change everything. We're going to start making our way towards a constitution. We're going to say, the king, you're full of baloney. We're not going to listen to what you say and believe that you have the absolute right of whatever you do. So they just decide to break the game. They got the game board, and they looked at it and they said, this is not working out in our favor. They flipped the table. Or rather, they start thinking about flipping the table. The table flipping comes later. As a side note, if you have heard about the right wing and the left wing, the political sides, the right and the left, you've heard of these things, it gets its start here. Summer of 1789, members of the French National Assembly are meeting to begin drafting a constitution. They are deeply divided onto how much authority is given to King Louis XVI. How much should he have? The debate rages, and the people are divided into those who sit on the right side of the presiding officer, who are more in favor of the king, the more conservative political group, and those who want to get rid of everything that the king wants to do. Those are the political left. So again, that is how we refer to one another, as those on the right are more conservative, those on the left are more liberal. And what does liberal mean? We'll talk about that. So here are some key events. I am not going to spend a whole lot of time in these. I'm going to spend a little bit more time in the key events of the French Revolution just because it's something that we don't talk about as much in America. July 14th, 1789, they stormed the Bastille. The Bastille is a fortress that they have turned into a prison. And this is seen as a figure or a representation of the king's right. This symbol of the old world, the old system. They have got political prisoners in there, only 7 of them at the time, and they're holding them captive, and this is just not right. So they see the Bastille as a symbol of royal tyranny. They challenge the king's authority. They negotiate the guards who are working at the Bastille. They convince them to open the gates and let them come in to free those prisoners. And as a result, the rioters murder the guards, and it is the first of much bloodshed happening. June of 1791, the king tries to leave. He tries to flee France. He is captured and brought back to Paris, and the little trust that the monarchy had is now gone, and those pro-republicans down with the monarchy, they start resenting him for that, and honestly, I kind of get it. So April of the next year, they do the most sensible things that they could possibly do, and they declare war on Austria, Prussia. They want to spread revolutionary ideas and preempt invasion because when the country is eating itself from the inside out, because there are lots of riots happening at this moment, there's not much food, there's not much money. So instead of other nations coming in to quell and take over France, because they're politically weak right now, they decide that the best defense is a strong offense. Let's go wage war because you know it's really good for the economy. War. Let's do that. It does not go very well at first. So now there's paranoia about who is selling us out to the other groups. Do we have spies in our midst? And also you've got your émigrés, the nobles who are leaving to go to other places. They can see the writing on the wall where the nobility, it's kind of on the way out. So we're just going to start leaving and taking our money with us. Oof. It's not looking so good. That summer, the military has some defeats. There are food shortages, more riots in Paris, leads to the, there's a group of people called the Jacobins, and when I say that there's a group of people, there are so many political groups that come and go throughout the French Revolution. We're not going to be able to spend any sort of amount of time. The Jacobins are very, very radical. Very radical. And the sans-culottes, they're going to rise and, pardon me, hang on one second. And we're back. The working class people are going to blame the king and the more moderate political groups who are involved in this. You got an insurrection group where the mob is going to storm the Tuileries Palace, the Tuileries. Again, I'm butchering all the French. I'm so sorry to our many, many French listeners. The king is arrested. The monarchy is suspended. The legislative assembly becomes replaced by more radical people. It becomes the National Convention. Oh boy. September of that year, you got the September massacres. Parisian crowds kill hundreds of suspected counter-revolutionaries in prisons amid invasion fears. So, under suspicion of not being with us, you are now our enemy and we are going to kill you. January 21st of 1793, it's only been 4 years, by the way, a little less than 4 years since this all started with the disastrous calling of the Estates General. Louis XVI is killed. He's executed by guillotine after being on trial for treason, and Europe looks on and says they just overthrew their king and killed him, publicly beheading him. Oh my. So now we've got lots of people who are forming coalitions against France. It's not good. Spring of that year, war gets worse. France gets invaded on multiple fronts, which are counter-revolutionary efforts. More wars happening. There's fighting in Marseille. As a result of all this, you've got more financial instability. There's an economic crisis, food shortages, inflation, rising prices. Oh no. Lots of speculators. It is a disaster. Throughout all of this, there is a de-Christianization campaign. And by the way, I'm skipping over dozens of just as interesting events in the French Revolution. It's awful that this happened to them, but it's fascinating to read about. The broader revolutionary agenda to reshape French society based on Enlightenment philosophy, diminishing the power of the monarchy and the Catholic Church, which were seen as basically being brothers and sisters together. They sought to get rid of all of it, gained momentum after the execution of the king as they looked to establish a completely secular state and promote Enlightenment ideals. Back in 1790, they made the clergy sign what's called the Civil Constitution of the Clergy. Basically, it said that you must swear allegiance to the state. If you do so, you can keep your office. If not, you need to leave. There were a group of clergy members who rejected these reforms. Guess what happened to a lot of those clergy who refused to sign it? They were killed. If they didn't get away, they were either imprisoned or executed. The law of suspects in 1793 intensified the de-Christianization campaign by allowing revolutionary governments to arrest and execute priests and those who support them. So now you just have a license to shed blood. You know what doesn't make sense? A 7-day calendar. Like, I know it's in the Bible and like it makes a lot of sense, but it doesn't make any sense. You know what does make sense? How about a base 10 system, the metric system? Let's go to a 10-day work week. The very appearance of a 7-day week indicates Christianity. We're getting rid of it. We're going to a 10-day work week. 10-day weeks don't work. That was the French Republican calendar. There are no Sundays, no religious holidays. It's impractical and it gets abandoned because guess what? The 7-day work week, which was instituted since the very creation of all of existence, works and it makes sense and it works for a reason because it was designed that way. So, wouldn't you know it, we have a couple of cults that start up around this time as well. The revolutionary government is going to start promoting state-sponsored religions. For you atheists who do not like any sort of idea of a god, you've got the cult of reason. And if you are more of the deistic variety, you get the cult of the supreme being. So we're going to have civic and rational celebrations instead of this nasty supernatural Christian nonsense. Churches, as a result, are closed. Their holy items are destroyed. They are going to be repurposed as temples of reason. Throughout all of this, there are very public anti-clerical parades, and celebrations of reason become common during this period. So they're completely gutting out what is happening with the church, and this is all basically Catholic at this point, though there are some holdouts of French Huguenots. Remember them? September of 1793, the National Convention declares that in response to the sans-culotte pressure, the military threats, internal dissents, there's only one way that we can save this burgeoning new Republic of France. Terror is the order of the day. In order to save the Republic, both real and imagined, we get a period in history known as the Reign of Terror. My goodness, it is one of the most radical and violent things that has ever happened ever, particularly during the French Revolution. What are some things that, whenever we talk about the Reign of Terror, what do we mean? We mean mass executions, repression, centralization of control under the Committee of Public Safety to defend the Republic against internal and external threats, both real and imagined. So, we've got wars on the fringes, civil unrest on the inside, along with economic hardship. We've got radicals who are fighting for what they believe in. During this time, we have a conservative estimate of around 16 or 17,000 to 40,000 deaths, mostly by guillotine. During this time, we are going to have even more radical anti-Christian policies. The Catholic Church is a nasty pillar of the old regime, and it is counter-revolution, so the church then becomes what the Bastille used to be. The revolutionaries are going to promote secularism, deism, in order to eradicate superstition and foster republican virtue. Churches are gone, the priests are executed, and society is going to be secularized as a whole. November of that year, Notre Dame itself is rededicated as a temple of reason. We have a woman who is instilled within as the goddess of reason, sat on a throne in the midst of Notre Dame on November 10th. The cult of reason, like I said, was for the atheists. They converted hundreds of churches into temples for civic worship. This idea of organized religion is a tool of repression. Guess what? Pope Pius VI condemned the revolution. The French did not care about that. And there were mass drownings of the French clergy in Nantes. They were executed. In spring, Christianity was effectively outlawed in much of the country. And let's briefly talk about a man. We'll get there. But Maximilien Robespierre, he saw that there was a whole lot of excessiveness in the atheistic cult of reason. So let's give them an alternative, the cult of the supreme being. Well, now there is a God. There are morals that should be the wind in our sails that tell us what is good and what is bad. In June 8th of 1794, we get the Festival of the Supreme Being that is held in Paris with Robespierre. He presides over it in a grand ceremony. And if you are one of the revolutionaries, you can't tell who to trust and who's your enemy, and you see this man who is the leader of the Jacobins put himself forward in a very public display as this cult of the supreme being, is he saying that he's the supreme being? Does he want to rule over us? We'll come back to that. There's a period within this, over 6 weeks, it's called the Great Terror. We get over 1,300 deaths in just Paris in a little over a month. In July of that year, 1794, we have the end of the Reign of Terror, called the Thermidorian Reaction. Because Robespierre was growing even more powerful, his own convention arrested him and all those who backed him. And if you look on the thing, Robespierre, the date of his death is the same day as the end of the Reign of Terror. How about that? He is taken, he is tried, and he is executed by his own people very publicly on July 28th, ending the Reign of Terror. And a fun fact about Robespierre, he was given an execution by guillotine face up, so he could see the blade coming. Yeah, they did not care much for Robespierre, but it's okay because Robespierre didn't care much for them either, I imagine. At the end of all this, now we've seen how far the excesses can go. There's now a more moderate implementation of some of what they want to do. So there's some stabilization, but there are tens of thousands who are dead. For the Catholic Church, they lost lands, they lost influence, they lost thousands of people because many of them are going to leave, to emigrate out. And this is going to set the stage for a man to arrive on the scene to bring order from chaos, a man named Napoleon Bonaparte, who is going to be mentioned in the same breath as several of the other important figures of note. So A few people you might recognize from this time. Louis XVI, what happened to him? He's executed. Marie Antoinette, what happened to her? She was executed. Maximilien Robespierre, he was executed. And we've got our favorite, the Marquis de Lafayette. He's a more moderate person. I mean, he's dead now, but he does not get executed. While all of this is happening, do you remember the Jesuits, the very, very radical group of this society, this monkish society, who were very big on persecution? Well, during this time, the church actually suppressed them and said that they were no longer allowed to operate. So they all fled eastward into Russia, and the Eastern Orthodox Church actually held on to and provided sanctuary for the Jesuits. The Jansenists are around right here. Remember, the Jansenists are the more Augustinian Catholics who believe in predestination. They're fighting each other this whole time. And then towards the end of it, essentially the Pope says, okay, the Jesuits, you can come back. And about that time, the Eastern Orthodox Church says, oh, you want these people back? Well, we don't want them anymore. So, Napoleon Bonaparte, a general. Everybody remembers him as being very, very short. Odds are he probably was not that short. He led a coup that ended the revolution. He basically saw that there was a whole lot of good and social cohesion that comes as a result of religion, and not just religion like generic morality, but specifically Catholicism. So he brought back the Catholic Church in order to help start stabilizing it. He later became emperor after overthrowing the previous emperor. Do you guys remember the Holy Roman Empire? If you've forgotten about it, it's okay. Basically, everyone else has forgotten about it. There were a whole lot of Austrian people who were the emperor, and now we've got Napoleon, but this essentially is going to be the end of emperors. They're gone after this. Catholicism is kept in subjection to Napoleon's state. Basically includes the secularization of marriage. Stop me if you've heard this. It's now essentially just a civil contract controlled by the state. There is now a secular system of public education. The churches are no longer have a monopoly on that anymore. Government approval is necessary for all religious catechisms, gatherings of clergy to transact church business, and the establishment of new seminaries. So the state must approve all of these things. There is a legal requirement that public prayers must be offered for the Republic as France's legitimate government. So you cannot pray for the restoration of the monarchy. That's outlawed. That is no. And also, as a result of this, can you imagine being a Catholic and you finally get back and you're like, oh, finally, we get to practice Christianity again. And Napoleon says, yeah, and so do the Protestants and the Jews. You're like, no, not like this. So we have freedom of religion happening here as well. The legal toleration of Protestantism and Judaism in France. You remember the previous policy of Quis regio, eius religio, he whose region the religion? Well, that's gone. Now no longer do we have an establishment of that, nor do we have one king, one law, one faith. Un roi, un loi, un foi. Again, like I said, I'm butchering French all over the place, just like the Reign of Terror. You're welcome. I'm here all evening. So Catholicism had been the bedrock for basically all of the religious French national life. Protestants had been persecuted for hundreds of years. The Huguenots were not very popular. The Jacobins had been very inclusive in their persecution of Christians. It didn't matter whether you had allegiance to the Pope or not. If you were a Christian, they were not your friend. But now Napoleon has basically brought peace and toleration to both Roman Catholics and those who are downstream of the revolution. And hopefully he's trying to bring people together so he has support of both. It's a very, very smart political move. So it's very pragmatic motivation for him to deepen his regime, and also because he believed that religion was useful in providing coherence to human society. The great philosophers of the French Enlightenment had taught this very thing. They had simply gone more for deism, though. Napoleon, though, he saw that there was definitely a little extra something in Christianity. And he brings all of this to bear, and he continues to, again, start campaigning. And in fact, there's actually a little bit of religious uprising that he has to take care of by sending 10,000 troops away to help quell that little brief rebellion. And as such, he does not have those troops for the Battle of Waterloo. And if you want to know what happens next, you can find it out. So, what's the lasting legacy of the French Revolution? Well, the monarchy is out, feudalism is out, the rise and triumph of the secular state is in. The Napoleonic Code, equality before law, meritocracy, the metric system is in, we've got a centralized administration. And again, you can see that even though it was a long and bloody road to get here, there are some good things that come out of this. Meritocracy, the fact that there's not just an absolute monarchy anymore. Here's a quote from Bruce Shelley that I thought was great. The democratic gospel of the French Revolution rested upon the glorification of man rather than God. The Church of Rome recognized this and struck back at the heresy as she has always done. She saw more clearly than did most Protestant churches that the devil, when it is to his advantage, is democratic. 10,000 people telling a lie do not turn the lie into truth. This is an important lesson from the age of progress for Christians of every generation. The freedom to vote and a chance to learn do not guarantee the arrival of utopia. The Christian faith has always insisted that the flaw in human nature is more basic than any flaw in man's political or social institution. So let's look at the themes of the French Revolution and see if we can perhaps see them in ours as well. The three rallying cries of the revolution were liberté, égalité, and fraternité. Liberty. We might think of, liberty, freedom. It's literally liberalism, the right to vote and have control of a representative government. This is what we mean whenever we talk about liberalism in terms of classic liberalism, is essentially representative government where every person has at least some say, some vote in how the country is run. Equality, equality. Another word, and again, these are the original thoughts, so try to divorce any sort of pre-existing modern-day notions onto it. Equality or socialism, the right of man irrespective of social or financial standing. Doesn't matter who your parents were or how much money you have just as many rights as your fellow man. Fraternity, brotherhood, nationalism, the ambition to be a master of your own territory and be in control of your national destiny. So again, the right to vote and have a control in a representative government, the right of man, regardless of where you come from or how much money you have, and the idea that you have a say in where your nation will go. So, one final thing to highlight as we look back at the French and American revolutions is where do they diverge? And I think ultimately it is this. The Americans, because they were more Christian, more Protestant, had a pessimistic or realistic idea of the heart of man. The heart of man is sinful. It will, left unchecked, go for every excess. And of course, Locke, the writing of Locke is going to influence this, as does Reformed theology and a little sprinkling of Enlightenment philosophy in there as well. Humans are flawed and sinful. The government is there to limit power via checks and balances to put a restraint upon the natural evil of man's heart. There's federalism, rule of law prevents tyranny. It's going to emphasize individual rights and limited government. On the other side, the French people, remember they say man is free and everywhere he is in chains. They believe that man is inherently good and it is society or the system that corrupts him. So when you look at the fact that the American Revolution had a more pessimistic idea of government and the French had a more optimistic or utopian idea of government, and you see how they implemented both of those ideas, it's very interesting. They believed that humans could be perfected through reason. The state could remake society built on equality and virtue. It led to a much more centralized power and a suppression of dissent in pursuit of these ideas. Because whenever we say liberty, égalité, fraternity, who gets to define those? At this point, it's just essentially the person with the biggest stick, and maybe with a sharp thing on top of it. And maybe this big stick can also fire bullets very fast at you, and they have a lot of them. So that's the government. What about religion? Throughout, even with the mixing of deism in there, the Americans are going to have a strong Christian influence, especially from Protestants, with their ethics, biblical notions of liberty based on the given law of God found within the Old Testament, restraint and limited government, and we are not going to push for aggressive de-Christianization, believe it or not. The French, on the other hand, are going to rip out the establishment roots and all and just see what grows in its place. They were anti-clerical. They pushed for secular society. They tried to kill the Catholic Church because they allied themselves with the monarchy. They promoted deism and atheism. They took things from the church. They destroyed them. They desecrated them. And they were very, very much so, whenever people say the separation of church and state, they've got more of a thought of the French Revolution rather than what the Americans mean by the same sort of thing. So, where does that leave us? It leaves us 250 years after the founding of our nation, where we can look at the sort of soil that our nation was built upon and influenced by the Enlightenment, especially coming from the Protestant tradition, the Reformation, the Renaissance, all of that. And we can see where one has an idea of total depravity, and the other has this idea that, no, society is the one that makes it wrong. When we look at these two things, one of them is consistent with a biblical worldview, and the other is not. Now, I'm not saying America is better than France because of this, but I'm not saying it now. No, we can see that there is a clear mandate for how we are to live our lives, both at the personal level as well as systematically and nationwide, and it's found within Scripture. Whenever we look at the law that was given to Moses, it's essentially blueprints on how to have a healthy society. It's loving God and loving your neighbor. How do we best do these two things? Well, it's revealed to us within the Word of God. Whenever we try to do either of those things without restraint, without giving the proper direction or motivation, things go off the rails very, very quickly. In fact, if you just flip over a couple of pages to the book of Judges after the Torah, you'll see how quickly it can go off the rails when everyone does what is right in their own eyes. That's what a lot of people would call freedom, is the ability to do what you want, when you want, and how you want, as long as you get what you want. That's not freedom. That's not love of neighbor. True love of neighbor is how can I contribute to a society that is going to embetter my neighbor? And embettering my neighbor embetters me, and if everybody's looking for the collective good of other people, that's what we're called to do. But it's all going to be found within the blueprints that are given to us by God. And of course, we can look to other nations to see where they get right and where they go wrong, our own nation included. Let's pray. God, we love you. We thank you for the wonderful men and women who've done some incredibly inspiring things in our past. We thank you for the lens with which we get to look at history, where we can see the good and the bad, the well-intentioned, the misguided, and we can see your truth persisting through all of it. We thank you for the preservation of your church and the fact that you have a guiding vision of how man is meant to live, to glorify you and enjoy you forever, Lord. May we always keep that as our anthem. While we may enjoy our countries and we love where you have placed us, Lord, truly the lines have fallen for us in good places. May we never, ever neglect to thank you for the blessings that you give us in our countries, Lord. May we always keep the cross as our central rallying cry. We love you, God. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Okay. Any questions? That's the end of the